He carried a small shield. The shield was suspended by a strap from his neck so that it would help support the weight. More importantly, that would allow his left hand, his shield hand, to be free. Not grasping the shield, but free, so that he could reach over and grasp his primary weapon. And his primary weapon was the sarissa. Now, we believe sarissas were somewhere between 16 and 18 feet long.
Up to this point, the principal combatants were carrying 7 to 8 foot spears. Philip gave the infantry longer spears. His phalanx now had greater standoff than the average Greek or Persians would have.
Think this way. 256 sarissas, 16 to 18 feet long, in front of the phalanx. A bristling hedgehog of spear points that the enemy could not get under, around, or over. How intimidating was the phalanx? Let's take a look at what a Persian trooper might have seen. Phalanx! Battle positions! Move! Ah!
At dawn on the morning of October 1st, 331 BC, the phalanx began to form on the battlefield at GUAGAMELA.
Arrayed to the right of the phalanx was generally a unit of heavy infantry, what the Greeks called hoplites. They carried a large shield, unlike the smaller phalangite shield. The shield was known as a hoplon. In combat, it could be used to bludgeon the enemy, back him up, knock him over, which would provide time for the hoplite to use his primary sidearm, a sword. In many cases, a leaf blade sword like this, a short sword, unlike the medieval cleavers that you see. This was a short sword, designed to do butchery in tight. The hoplite could hide his weapon so that you had no idea where he was going to strike. He didn't advertise what he was going to do with the weapon. He could come in low, or he could come in high. He was not in the mood to sword fight with an enemy. He was in the mood to use his large hoplon shield to push that enemy back, to keep progressing, to never lose his own momentum, so that if the enemy should stumble or get his feet tangled up, he was on the ground. And when he was on the ground, the hoplite took care of him.
With the armies in place, the battle lines at GUAGAMELA have now been drawn.
Darius was apparently planning GUAGAMELA to be the final battle.
This is a turning point for Alexander and the future of the world. The Persians have brought together the largest army ever formed, perhaps as many as 250,000 men. Alexander consists of just 45,000.
The stakes were high. For Darius, he knew that if he lost this battle, he would probably lose his empire. For Alexander, the stakes were high too. He had staked everything on defeating Darius and becoming the king of Persia.
Alexander risks everything on this one battle. If he wins, the richest empire on earth will be his. If he loses, 45,000 men will be slaughtered, and Greece will be open to invasion. A 26-year-old is about to fight a battle that will determine the future of 2 continents. Alexander the Great and his army of 45,000 Macedonians face a Persian army that is nearly 5 times their number. Their army's best warriors stretch in an unbroken line for 2.5 miles. While concerned with the numbers, Alexander trained his men for just such an encounter.
Darius had laid out his battle line in a way that was a tremendous challenge for anybody. It was 2.5 miles long, and there were fairways, killing zones laid out for scythe chariots. Chariots with iron blades on the front and on the sides. The Macedonians, no matter how far they stretched out their line, they still were going to be overlapped by about 1/2 mile. So Alexander was walking into a double envelopment where Darius was going to send his cavalry from each side while he was sending these scythe chariots at Alexander. Well, if you're Alexander, what are you going to do against something like that?
Alexander viewed each battle as if it were a chess game, and he knew this would be a difficult match.
Alexander viewed his army metaphorically as a hammer and an anvil. The phalanx would serve as the anvil. His cavalry, the hammer, would push the enemy. So between the hammer and the anvil, the enemy force would be crushed.
In every previous battle, Alexander's hammer and anvil tactics had worked flawlessly. But at GUAGAMELA, this approach was useless. With a Persian line stretching for over 2 miles, Alexander's cavalry could not possibly outflank the enemy. He would have to come up with an entirely new strategy. First, he grouped his infantry into the phalanx formation, 256 warriors to a square, 16 across, and 16 deep, and nearly impossible to stop. This approach to warfare was new to the ancient world. Next, how best to utilize his other great asset, his cavalry. Armed like no other and trained to work as a unit, the riders of Macedonia were considered the finest horsemen in the world. Alexander's cavalrymen wore bronze helmets and breastplates. Each was armed with a lance called a ziston.
The lance was approximately 10 feet long. The average cavalry lance was more like 6 feet long, which gave a reach so that you could contact the enemy before he could contact you.
The cavalrymen also carried a curved single-edged sword called a kopis.
A kopis is a great weapon, much more sophisticated than the leaf blade we saw the infantry have. Because of this heavy belly, because of the metal here, and the thinness and lightness here, when you slash, that momentum gives you a lot of power, like a machete or an axe. You can do a lot of damage, hacking and cutting. Great for hamstringing.
Alexander's challenge is how best to utilize the phalanx and cavalry to his advantage. And what he does next will turn traditional strategy on its head. Rather than face the enemy head-on, Alexander arranges for his outnumbered infantry to face the Persian center at an angle.
He comes to the battlefield arrayed in what for the day seemed to be a strange formation. If we were to look at this in modern military terms, if we were to look at the way Alexander arrayed his Macedonian forces, we would say that he approached Darius's line of battle in a left echelon formation with his left flank refused.
The modern military terms mean that the Macedonian phalanx were arrayed at an angle, with the left side facing outward away from the battle, expecting an attack from the side. And the echelon, or angled line of attack, couldn't help but confuse the enemy, who had never seen such an approach to battle before. The Macedonian front line begins to march toward the enemy. On the front line of the Persian force are the Immortals, Darius's elite guard.
If one was killed, somebody else stepped up and got in their place. That's why they were known as the Immortals, because there were always 10,000 no matter what you did.
As the Macedonians get closer, Darius believes Alexander's angled approach has given the Persians an enormous advantage. Darius seized the open ground between the Persian cavalry